Part 1, Keeper of Silence. Dr. Keziah Navar had been dead for 17 years, though her heart still beat and her lungs still drew the recycled air of Station Terminus. That's when she took the position, when she became the Archivist of the Galactic Extinction Repository, when she stopped being part of the living world and became instead a custodian of its endings. The station hung in the void between spiral arms, deliberately positioned where no sun's light could reach unfiltered, where the background radiation of creation itself was the only constant companion. They built it here because grief required distance, and the accumulation of so much death demanded isolation. Keziah was the only human aboard. The maintenance was automated, the supplies delivered by drone every 8 months, the communication arrays managed by algorithms that needed no sleep, no comfort, no reassurance that their work mattered. But Keziah was here because someone must witness. The repository itself occupied the central core of the station, a cylindrical chamber 300 meters high and 60 meters in diameter, lined with crystalline storage matrices that glowed with a soft bioluminescence, like the ghost light of deep-sea creatures. Each matrix contained the final transmission of a species that no longer existed. Not their history, not their achievements, not the accumulated knowledge of their civilization, just their last words, their farewell, the single message they chose to leave behind when they knew the end had come. There were 4,732 messages in the collection. Keziah knew them all. Every morning, though morning was a meaningless concept here, where no sun rose and no darkness truly fell, she began her rounds in the oldest section of the archive. The matrices here were darker, their bioluminescence dimmed by the sheer weight of time, containing transmissions from species that died when Earth's sun was still a swirling disk of cosmic dust. The Pre-Lithians, whose message was a single mathematical proof of their existence, expressed in prime numbers and geometric constants. The Void Singers, who left behind a sound that took 3 hours to play in full, a harmonic that supposedly captured the resonance of their collective consciousness at the moment of dissolution. She walked the spiral pathways that wound through the archive, her footsteps echoing in the vast silence, and she listened. Not with her ears, most of the transmissions weren't audible to human senses, but with the translation interface that lived in her neural implant, converting the alien farewells into something her human brain could process. Sometimes words. Sometimes images. Sometimes pure emotion, translated into colors and textures and the phantom sensation of touching something that no longer existed. The crystalline collective left a message that felt like frost forming on glass, like the moment before ice shattered. The beneath dwellers left something that tasted of soil and roots and the slow decay of organic matter returning to Earth. The luminal threads left only the sensation of falling through light, endless and serene. Each one was beautiful. Each one was unbearable. Keziah had been doing this for 17 years, and she thought she had learned to maintain the necessary emotional distance. She thought she had become numb to it, the way doctors became numb to suffering, the way soldiers became numb to death. But she was wrong. The truth was that each transmission had burrowed into her, become part of her, until she carried 4,732 extinctions in her chest like shrapnel. Today she was reviewing the transmission of the architects of forgetting, a species that existed for 12 million years before succumbing to what their message described as the weight of memory. They built their entire civilization around the act of preservation, creating vast structures to house every experience, every thought, every moment of their existence. In the end, they collapsed under the enormity of their own history, unable to move forward because they were crushed beneath the accumulated past. Their final transmission was housed in Matrix 3847, and when Keziah interfaced with it, she experienced their ending as a kind of gentle suffocation, like being buried in silk. There were words, translated through layers of linguistic algorithms into something approximating human language. We leave this message not as warning but as recognition. We have become our own monument. We have forgotten how to forget. Let what comes after us know that preservation and death are sometimes the same thing. She stood before the matrix for a long time after the transmission ended, her hand resting on the cool crystal surface. The bioluminescence pulsed beneath her palm like a heartbeat that had stopped years ago but whose echo remained, trapped in amber. "I understand," she whispered to the dead species, as she always did. "I remember you." It was a ritual she had developed over the years, this speaking to the extinct. She knew they couldn't hear her. She knew the transmissions were recordings, echoes, ghosts of meaning that had been captured and preserved but held no consciousness, no awareness. But she spoke to them anyway, because someone should. Because in the vast indifference of the universe, someone should acknowledge that they had existed, that they had mattered, that their ending deserved to be witnessed with something more than clinical detachment. The archive was organized chronologically, arranged in a vast spiral that descended from the oldest transmissions at the top to the most recent at the bottom. Keziah followed the pathway down, her route taking her past species after species, extinction after extinction. The Tidewalkers, who drowned when their moon's orbit decayed and the seas rose to swallow their world. The Ember Minds, who burned themselves out in a final apotheosis of thought, pushing their consciousness to speeds that consumed them like fire. The Patient Watchers, who simply stopped, their message a peaceful acceptance that their time had ended and they were ready to rest. Each transmission was unique. Each species died in its own way, for its own reasons. Natural disasters, resource depletion, war, plague, cosmic accidents, voluntary extinction. The universe was endlessly creative in the ways it ended things. But as Keziah walked, something nagged at her, a feeling she couldn't quite articulate. She had been experiencing it more frequently in recent months, a sense of pattern lurking just beneath the surface of the archive, like a shape glimpsed through frosted glass. She couldn't see it clearly, couldn't define it, but she felt its presence the way one might feel eyes watching from the darkness. She had mentioned it once, months ago, during her quarterly check-in with the Repository Council. Dr. Chen, her liaison, had listened patiently through the communication lag, his face pixelated and distorted by the distance between them. Pattern recognition is a known psychological phenomenon in isolation, he had said, his voice clinical and concerned. The human brain craves structure, especially in the absence of social stimulation. Have you been keeping up with your therapeutic exercises? Keziah had said yes, because it was easier than explaining that this felt different, that this wasn't pareidolia or isolation-induced hallucination. This felt real. She hadn't mentioned it again. Now, standing in the middle section of the archive, surrounded by the deaths of 3,000 species, Keziah closed her eyes and tried to sense what was bothering her. The translations played at the edge of her consciousness, a susurrus of final words, a murmur of endings. She let them wash over her, not focusing on any individual message but allowing them to blend together into a kind of background noise. And there, hidden in the cacophony, she felt it again, a rhythm. A structure. Something that repeated across time and space and evolutionary history, something that connected these disparate species in a way that shouldn't be possible. Her eyes snapped open. She stood still for a moment, her heart hammering in her chest, then turned and began walking quickly back toward her quarters. She had work to do. Real work. The kind of work that had first drawn her to xenolinguistics, to the study of extinct civilizations, to this lonely position at the end of all things. The kind of work that required she stop simply witnessing and start analyzing. Part 2, Patterns in the Dark. Keziah's quarters occupied a small module attached to the outer ring of the station, a space barely large enough for a bed, a desk, and a narrow viewport that looked out into the absolute darkness between stars. She had decorated it minimally, a few photographs from Earth, a plant that struggled gamely in the artificial light, a threadbare blanket her daughter had given her before she left. Before she had chosen death over life. She pushed the thought away and sat down at her desk, activating the holographic display. The interface hummed to life, projecting a three-dimensional representation of the archive into the air before her. 4,732 points of light, arranged in a spiral, each one representing a species that had died. "Computer," she said, her voice rough from disuse. She spoke aloud so rarely now. "Display all transmissions in chronological order. Begin pattern analysis." The system responded immediately, the points of light rearranging themselves into a timeline that stretched across her small room. The oldest transmissions clustered at one end, the most recent at the other, with vast gaps between them where the galaxy had been empty of intelligent life, or where species had thrived without reaching the end. Keziah leaned forward, studying the display. Analyze for recurring elements. Linguistic structures. Mathematical constants. Symbolic patterns. Cross-reference across species origin, biology, and technological development level. The computer worked in silence for several minutes, processing data that represented billions of years of galactic history. Keziah waited, her hands clasped together, her knuckles white. She had been an archivist for 17 years. Before that, she had been a professor of xenolinguistics at the University of New Beijing, one of the leading experts in the translation of alien languages and the reconstruction of dead civilizations from fragmentary evidence. She had decoded the literature of the glassmakers. She had reconstructed the philosophical traditions of the spiral thinkers. She had spent 30 years of her life studying the ways intelligence manifested across the galaxy, the infinite variations on consciousness and culture and meaning-making. And then her daughter had died. Suicide. The words still felt like broken glass in her mouth. Maya had been 26, brilliant, troubled, and Keziah had been too absorbed in her work to notice how deep the troubles ran. Too fascinated by dead aliens to pay attention to her living child. The guilt had been insurmountable. Keziah had left Earth, left her university, left everything that reminded her of her failure, and applied for the only position in human space that required absolute isolation, Archivist of the Galactic Extinction Repository. They had accepted immediately. No one else wanted the job. The computer chimed, pulling her back to the present. Pattern analysis complete. 11,407 recurring elements identified across 73% of transmissions. Keziah's breath caught. Display primary patterns. The holographic timeline shifted, certain transmissions highlighting in different colors. Red for one pattern, blue for another, green for a third. The colors cascaded across the timeline like a code, like a message written in Extinction. Specify nature of primary pattern, Keziah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Primary pattern identified in 48% of transmissions, sequential numerical encoding embedded in transmission structure. Pattern appears to increment across chronological order, suggesting intentional sequence. Keziah stared at the display, her mind racing. What kind of sequence? Unknown. Pattern incomplete. Current data suggests larger sequence spanning multiple transmissions. Individual transmissions contain fragments. Show me. The computer isolated 12 transmissions, arranging them in chronological order. The first was from the pre-Lithians, the species that had died when Earth's sun was still forming. Their transmission was a mathematical proof, elegant and simple. The second was from a species called the Stone Singers, dead for 2 billion years, whose message was a geological survey of their world encoded in crystallized sound. The third was from the Tide Walkers, whose drowning world had left behind detailed measurements of gravitational forces and orbital mechanics. Keziah studied them, her trained eye beginning to see what the computer had identified. Each transmission contained information that seemed irrelevant to the species ending. Why would a species facing extinction spend their final transmission cataloging mathematical constants, or recording geological data, or measuring orbital mechanics? Unless they weren't meant for the species sending them. Unless they were meant for someone else. Someone who came after. Computer, analyze pattern for directionality. Are these fragments building towards something? A blueprint? An instruction set? The processing took longer this time. Keziah stood and paced her small quarters, her mind churning through possibilities. She had always assumed that each species' final transmission was self-contained, a last statement of identity, a farewell to the universe. But what if she had been wrong? What if the transmissions weren't endings but transitions? What if each species was leaving instructions for whoever came next? But that raised an impossible question: how would they know? How would each species, separated by billions of years and millions of light years, know to leave a fragment of the same larger message? There was no communication between them, no continuity of culture or knowledge. They were isolated by time and space, each one arising independently, living independently, dying independently. Unless they weren't isolated. Unless something was guiding them. The computer chimed again. Analysis suggests instruction set for construction of large-scale object or phenomenon. Insufficient data for complete reconstruction. Current fragments provide approximately 37% of total required information. Keziah's legs went weak. She sat down heavily on her bed, staring at the holographic display. An instruction set. A blueprint. Spread across thousands of species, across billions of years, each one adding a piece to a puzzle they couldn't possibly have known existed. Computer, she said, her voice shaking, extrapolate completion timeline. If pattern continues, when would the full instruction set be complete? The pause was longer this time. When the computer answered, its synthesized voice seemed almost reluctant. Based on current rate of species extinction and transmission pattern frequency, estimated completion, between 200 and 600 years from present date. 200 to 600 years. Within the potential lifespan of humanity. Within the window where humans might be the ones to complete the sequence. Keziah stood abruptly and walked to the viewport, pressing her forehead against the cold transparent aluminum. Outside, the darkness was absolute. No stars visible from this angle, no galaxies, no hint of light. Just the void, infinite and patient. "Computer," she said quietly, "search repository records for any species matching human evolutionary profile, technological development level, and current chronological period. How many other species have existed in circumstances similar to humanity's?" Searching. The seconds stretched. Keziah's breath fogged the viewport, obscuring the darkness beyond. 7,214 species identified with similar parameters. All extinct. Average survival time post-industrialization, 473 years. Humanity current age post-industrialization, 291 years. The numbers hung in the air like a sentence. Humanity had, on average, less than 200 years left. And if the pattern held, if the sequence continued, humanity would be expected to contribute its fragment to the larger message before the end came. Keziah closed her eyes. Her daughter's face appeared in her mind, unbidden. Maya at 6, laughing as they built sandcastles on the beach. Maya at 16, angry and distant, already showing signs of the depression that would eventually consume her. Maya at 26, lying in the morgue, her face peaceful in a way it never had been in life. "What did you see that I couldn't?" Keziah had asked the corpse, knowing no answer would come. "What did you know about endings that I was too blind to understand?" Now, standing in a station full of extinctions, Keziah thought she might finally understand. Her daughter had sensed something that Keziah, with all her academic knowledge, had missed, that sometimes the universe gave you a role to play in a story larger than yourself, and sometimes that role was simply to end, to make space for what came next, to pass the message along even if you never understood what it meant. She opened her eyes and turned back to the display. "Computer, access latest census data for human population. Access United Earth Government survival projections. Access all current existential threat assessments." The data streamed into the display. Global population, 11 billion. Climate crisis, stabilized but fragile. Nuclear arsenals, decommissioned but knowledge preserved. Artificial intelligence development, carefully controlled. Pandemic preparedness, high. Asteroid impact probability, negligible for next 1,000 years. By all measurable metrics, humanity was doing well. They had survived their most dangerous period, the centuries where technological power outpaced wisdom. They had reached the stars, established colonies on 6 worlds, made contact with 2 other living species. They were thriving. But the data said otherwise. The pattern said otherwise. 4,732 species had come before, and all of them had fallen. The universe didn't care about careful planning or preparedness. It had its own rhythm, its own requirements. And humanity's time was coming. "Computer," Keziah said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her stomach, "has humanity submitted a final transmission to the repository?" Negative. No final transmission on file for species Homo sapiens. Are they aware that they're supposed to? Negative. Repository protocol dictates that final transmissions are voluntary submissions made by species themselves upon recognition of imminent extinction. No species has ever been informed of the requirement. Because there was no requirement. The repository was meant to be passive, a memorial rather than an instruction. But if Keziah's analysis was correct, if the pattern was real, then it wasn't passive at all. It was a machine, a system, a process that had been running for billions of years, guiding species toward their ends and ensuring they left behind the pieces of something larger. Something that humanity would be expected to complete. Or at least, to add to before they were gone. Keziah stood in her quarters for a long time, the holographic display casting colored light across her face. Outside, the void waited, patient and eternal. Inside, the archive hummed with the voices of the dead, 4,732 species all speaking at once, all saying the same thing in fragments and pieces. "We built this for you. We didn't know what it was, but we built it anyway. Now it's your turn. Add your piece. Complete the sequence. Pass the message along. And then die, as we all did, as you all must." Keziah took a deep breath and made a decision that would haunt her for the rest of her life, however long that might be. She would trace the pattern. She would decode the sequence. She would figure out what these extinct species had been building across the vast expanse of time. And then she would decide whether humanity needed to know. Part 3, The Architecture of Extinction. For 3 months, Keziah barely slept. She pulled every transmission that showed evidence of the pattern, subjected them to analysis so detailed that the computer's processors ran hot enough to warm her quarters. She cross-referenced astronomical data, geological surveys, engineering schematics, mathematical proofs, artistic expressions, philosophical treatises. The extinct species had hidden their fragments everywhere, woven them into the fabric of their final messages like acrostics in poetry, like watermarks in paper. The pattern was elegant and horrifying. Each species contributed according to its nature. The mathematically inclined left equations. The builders left architectural specifications. The artists left dimensional relationships encoded in color and form. The philosophers left conceptual frameworks. And each piece, when extracted and analyzed, revealed itself to be part of a larger design, a blueprint for something vast and incomprehensible. Keziah worked in a fugue state, eating when the computer reminded her, sleeping in 2-hour increments when her body simply shut down from exhaustion. The archive became her entire universe. She walked the spiral pathways in her dreams, the bioluminescent matrices pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat, the voices of the dead whispering their secrets in languages she was learning to understand. On day 73, she had a breakthrough. It happened while she was reviewing the transmission of the chorus builders, a hive mind species that had existed for 8 million years before fragmenting into individual consciousness and losing the cohesion that had sustained them. Their message was a sonic architecture, a three-dimensional sound sculpture that described, when properly analyzed, the structural requirements for a specific type of gravitational field manipulation. Keziah had been staring at the data for hours, her vision blurred, when suddenly the pattern resolved. She saw how the chorus builder's contribution connected to the Tidewalker's orbital mechanics, which connected to the Pre-Lithians' mathematical constants, which connected to the Stonesinger's geological survey. They were all describing the same thing from different angles, like 6 blind humans describing an elephant. They were describing how to build a beacon. Not a simple beacon, not a radio transmitter or a light source. Something far more fundamental. The species had left instructions for how to manipulate space-time itself, how to create a gravitational signature that would ripple across the galaxy, how to essentially ring a bell that would echo through the fabric of reality itself. But a beacon to signal what? And to whom? Keziah pulled up the full analysis, her hands shaking as she worked through the data. The blueprint was roughly 37% complete, as the computer had estimated. The remaining 63% would require contributions from future species that would need to add their pieces before they too went extinct. If the pattern held, humanity would be one of those species. She called up a projection, asking the computer to estimate what the completed beacon might look like. The hologram that appeared in her quarters was breathtaking, a structure that existed simultaneously in normal space and in the gravitational substrate beneath it, creating a standing wave that would propagate outward at the speed of causality itself. The beacon wouldn't just broadcast a signal, it would alter the fundamental properties of space-time in a specific pattern, writing a message into the structure of the universe itself. A message that would be permanent, eternal, unchangeable. Computer, Keziah whispered, what would a signal like this communicate? Insufficient data. Purpose of beacon cannot be determined from available information. Speculation, location marker, temporal coordinate, universal constant verification, dimensional transfer protocol, or unknown function. Keziah sank into her chair, overwhelmed. The extinct species had been building this for billions of years, each one adding its piece without knowing what the final product would be, without even knowing they were participating in a larger project. It was beautiful and terrible, a collaborative artwork spanning geological time, created by artists who never met and never would. But who had started it? Who had designed the overall structure and hidden it in pieces across the transmissions? Who was ensuring that each species played its role? And most importantly, what happened when the beacon was complete? Keziah spent the next month trying to answer those questions. She analyzed the oldest transmissions, looking for evidence of a first species, an originator who might have created the initial design. She found nothing. The pattern seemed to go back as far as the archive itself, suggesting either that it predated the repository's founding, or that the first pieces had been lost to time. She searched for evidence of external influence, signs that the extinct species had been guided or manipulated into leaving their specific contributions. Again, nothing. Each species seemed to have chosen their transmission independently, without coercion or direction. Which left only one possibility, so strange that Keziah resisted it for weeks before finally accepting its logic: the pattern was emergent. It wasn't designed by any single intelligence. Instead, it arose naturally from the process of extinction itself, from the way consciousness reflected on its own ending, from the universal impulses that drove dying species to leave something behind. The beacon wasn't being built. It was building itself, through the collective unconscious of extinction, through some fundamental property of how intelligence processed its own mortality. Which meant it was inevitable. Which meant humanity couldn't avoid contributing to it, any more than the 4,732 species before them had avoided it. Which meant Keziah had to figure out what humanity's contribution needed to be. She began studying the gaps in the pattern, the missing pieces that hadn't yet been filled. The computer helped her identify what kinds of information were still needed: certain types of quantum calculations, specific approaches to consciousness modeling, particular frameworks for understanding temporal causality. The blueprint needed these pieces to be complete, and based on humanity's technological and philosophical development, they were uniquely positioned to provide at least some of them. But not all. The pattern suggested that 3 or 4 more species would be needed after humanity to finish the work. Maybe more, depending on how each species interpreted the requirements. Keziah found herself thinking about succession, about legacy, about the way knowledge passed from generation to generation. She thought about her own field, xenolinguistics, and how each translator built on the work of those who came before, how understanding accumulated across time until dead languages yielded up their secrets. The beacon was the ultimate translation project, 4,000 species all contributing to a single message, each one translating the fundamental truths of existence into their own conceptual framework, passing it along to whoever came next. Her daughter would have understood this, Keziah thought. Maya had been a musician, a composer who worked in generative systems, creating pieces that evolved and changed based on algorithmic rules. She had talked often about music that composed itself, about the beauty of emergent complexity, about how the most profound art came not from individual genius but from the interaction of simple rules applied across time. "It's like the universe is improvising," Maya had said once, during one of their rare good conversations. Every musician playing their own part, but somehow it all fits together into something bigger than any of them intended. Keziah hadn't understood then. She had been too focused on her dead languages, her extinct cultures, her academic analysis of meaning that no longer had speakers to speak it. But now, surrounded by 4,000 extinctions, she finally heard what her daughter had been trying to tell her. The universe was improvising. Species were the instruments. Extinction was the finale. And the beacon was the song they were all composing together, one note at a time, across billions of years. The question was, what happened when the song was finished? Part 4, The Weight of Warning. On day 147 of her research, Keziah received a communication from Earth. It was from Dr. Chen, her quarterly check-in arriving exactly on schedule despite the 6-hour lag time for messages to travel between station terminus and human space. His face appeared on her display, pixelated and distorted as always, his expression professionally concerned. "Dr. Navar, your latest reports have been somewhat irregular. The medical monitors show elevated stress hormones and significantly decreased sleep patterns. The psychological evaluation algorithms are flagging several concerning indicators. I need you to confirm that you're maintaining protocol and engaging with the therapeutic resources available to you." Keziah stared at his frozen image, knowing she had 6 hours before her response would reach him, 6 hours before he would hear what she had to say. 6 hours to decide whether to tell the truth or continue hiding. She had been lying in her reports, minimizing her findings, submitting bland summaries that suggested nothing more than routine archival work. She had told herself it was because she needed more time to verify the pattern, to be absolutely certain before she made claims that would sound insane to anyone who hadn't spent 17 years living among extinctions. But that was only part of the truth. The deeper truth was that she was afraid of what would happen if she told them. Afraid of how humanity would react to learning that their extinction was not only inevitable but imminent. Afraid of the panic, the denial, the desperate attempts to avoid a fate that had already claimed 4,732 species before them. Afraid that warning them would only make things worse. She had spent weeks considering the ethics of her silence. She had read philosophy, theology, crisis management theory. She had studied the few examples from history where people had known about impending disasters and chosen not to warn others. Sometimes it was cowardice. Sometimes it was calculation, a belief that warning would cause more harm than the disaster itself. Sometimes it was a kind of mercy, letting people live their last days in peace rather than terror. Keziah didn't know which category she fell into. Maybe all three. She composed her response carefully, keeping her voice steady, her expression neutral. Dr. Chen, I appreciate your concern. The irregularities in my reports are the result of a significant discovery I've been verifying. I'll be submitting a comprehensive analysis within the next month. As for my stress levels, they're elevated but manageable. I'm maintaining protocol. Navar out. She sent the message and sat back, knowing she had just bought herself another month before the Repository Council started asking serious questions. A month to decide what to do with the knowledge she had gained. A month to figure out whether humanity deserved to know it was dying. That night, though night was still a meaningless concept on station terminus, Keziah couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, Maya's face appearing in the darkness like a ghost. What would you do? She asked her dead daughter. Would you warn them? Would you stay silent? Would you spend their last years preparing them for the end, or let them live in ignorance? Maya didn't answer. The dead never did. But Keziah found herself remembering the last conversation they'd had, 3 days before Maya died. They had fought, as they always did, about Keziah's work, about her obsession with dead civilizations, about her failure to be present in her daughter's life. You love extinct species more than living people, Maya had said, her voice bitter. You spend all your time studying things that don't exist anymore while the people around you are dying and you don't even notice. That's not fair, Keziah had replied. My work is important. Understanding how civilizations fall helps us prevent our own collapse. Maya had laughed, a sound without humor. Does it, though? Or does it just give you an excuse to avoid dealing with the actual world? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you've already chosen extinction. You're already gone. You're just waiting for your body to catch up with your mind. Keziah had been furious, had said things she regretted, had hung up without saying goodbye. 3 days later, Maya was dead. And Keziah had realized her daughter had been right. She had chosen extinction. She had been living among the dead for so long that she had forgotten how to be among the living. So she had become the archivist, made it official, accepted the position that would let her spend the rest of her life with the dead. Because at least the dead didn't disappoint you. At least the dead didn't demand things you couldn't give. At least the dead couldn't take their own lives and leave you drowning in guilt. Now, staring at the ceiling of her quarters, Keziah wondered if she was making the same mistake again. Choosing the dead over the living. Choosing the pattern over the people. Choosing knowledge over mercy. She got out of bed and walked to the viewport. The darkness outside was absolute, but she imagined she could see the beacon anyway, the gravitational structure that was slowly being built across time and space, the message being written into the fabric of reality itself. Somewhere out there, in a future she wouldn't live to see, the beacon would be complete. The song would be finished. And whatever came next, whatever species inherited the galaxy after humanity was gone, would receive the message that 4,000 species had spent billions of years constructing. And humanity would have added its piece. Would have contributed its fragment to the eternal pattern. Would have played its note in the universal improvisation. The question was, did they deserve to know they were doing it? Keziah pressed her forehead against the viewport, her breath fogging the transparent aluminum. In the reflection, she saw her own face, older now, marked by 17 years of isolation and grief, but still recognizably herself. Still human. Still alive, even if she felt dead inside. I don't know what to do, she whispered to the void. I don't know how to carry this. I don't know if I'm strong enough. The void, as always, offered no answer. But in the silence, Keziah felt something shift inside her. A decision forming, crystallizing, becoming solid enough to hold on to. She would document everything. Every detail of the pattern, every piece of the blueprint, every calculation and specification and fragment. She would create a complete record of what she had discovered, compile it into a form that others could understand, translate it from the language of extinct species into something humans could work with. And then she would hide it. Not permanently, but she would make sure it wasn't discovered until humanity was ready. Until they had reached the point where extinction was inevitable anyway, where the knowledge wouldn't cause panic but might offer purpose. where they could choose to participate in the pattern not out of fear but out of a desire to leave something behind, to add their voice to the chorus, to play their part in the song. She would become, in effect, the guardian of humanity's ending. The keeper not just of the past but of the future. The one who decided when and how her species learned about its fate. It was an enormous responsibility. An impossible responsibility. But then again, she had spent 17 years learning to carry impossible weights. What was one more? Keziah turned from the viewport and sat back down at her desk. She activated her display and began to write, documenting everything she had learned, creating the record that would eventually, decades or centuries from now, be discovered and deciphered and used to guide humanity toward its contribution to the beacon. She wrote for her daughter, who had understood endings better than anyone. She wrote for the 4,732 species whose deaths she had witnessed. She wrote for the unknown intelligences that would come after humanity, who would inherit the message and perhaps, finally, understand what it meant. But most of all, she wrote for herself. Because in documenting the pattern, in accepting the inevitability of extinction, in choosing to participate rather than resist, she found something she hadn't felt in 17 years. She found peace. Part 5, The Transmission Sequence. 3 years passed before Keziah completed her documentation. 3 years of painstaking work, translating the pattern from 4,000 species worth of data into something a human could potentially understand and implement. She organized it into modules, each one representing a different aspect of the beacon's construction: gravitational mathematics, quantum entanglement protocols, consciousness modeling frameworks, temporal causality mapping. The work was exhausting and exhilarating. She felt like an archaeologist reconstructing an ancient temple from scattered stones, like a translator bridging millennia of semantic drift, like a musician transcribing a symphony she could only hear in fragments. And slowly, piece by piece, the full blueprint emerged. The beacon, when complete, would be a gravitational structure approximately 3 light-years in diameter, existing in a state of quantum superposition across multiple dimensional frequencies. It would require enormous energy to construct, more than a single species could reasonably generate, but the design was clever. Each species' contribution would build on the previous ones, creating a cascade effect where each new addition amplified the existing structure. By the time humanity added its piece, the beacon would already be partially active, humming with the accumulated energy of thousands of extinct civilizations. But it was the purpose that kept Keziah awake at night, kept her staring at the equations and specifications, kept her running simulations until her eyes burned and her head pounded. The beacon wasn't a communication device. Not exactly. It was a summons. The gravitational signature, when complete, would propagate backward through time as well as forward, creating a standing wave in the causal structure of the universe. Any sufficiently advanced intelligence, any species capable of perceiving gravitational patterns at a quantum level, would detect it instantly, regardless of when or where they existed in space-time. The message encoded in the beacon structure was simple, elegant, and terrifying: we were here. We existed. We died. Come find us. It was a monument. A memorial. A gravestone for an entire galaxy's worth of civilizations, all crying out in unison across the void, remember us. We mattered. Don't let us be forgotten. But it was also an invitation. A beacon drawing something toward the place where all these species had lived and died. Drawing it across space and time, pulling it inevitably toward the moment when the beacon was completed and activated. Drawing it here. Keziah sat in her quarters, staring at the implications of what she had discovered. Somewhere in the future, perhaps centuries from now, perhaps millennia, the beacon would be finished. The last species would add its final piece. The gravitational wave would ripple out across space-time, backward and forward, announcing to the universe that this sector of the galaxy had been home to intelligence, had been special, had been worth remembering. And something would answer. What that something might be, Keziah couldn't know. The pattern offered no clues. The extinct species hadn't known either. They had been guided by instinct, by the universal impulse to be remembered, to matter, to leave something behind when they died. But Keziah, with her 3 years of analysis and her 17 years of living among extinctions, had developed a theory. It wasn't based on evidence, exactly. It was more like intuition, the kind of knowledge that comes from spending enough time with a mystery that you start to understand its shape even if you can't see its face. The something that would answer the beacon would be whatever came next. Not the next species to evolve in this galaxy. Those species were already part of the pattern, already contributing their pieces to the beacon. No, this would be something from outside. Something that had been waiting for the beacon to be complete, for the invitation to be issued, for the door to be opened. Something that humanity would never meet, never understand, never even comprehend the existence of. But something that would inherit everything. All the knowledge, all the culture, all the meaning that 4,000 species had created and preserved and passed along. The beacon wasn't just a gravestone, it was a will, a testament, a transfer of inheritance from the dying to the yet unborn. Humanity's contribution would be part of that inheritance. Their mathematics, their art, their philosophy, their understanding of consciousness and causality and the nature of existence itself, all of it encoded in the fragment they would add to the beacon, all of it passed along to whatever came next. It was beautiful. It was horrifying. It was the most profound thing Keziah had ever encountered in her decades of studying dead civilizations. And now she had to decide what to do with it. She could destroy the documentation. Delete every file, purge every backup, ensure that no one ever discovered what she had learned. Humanity would die eventually anyway, the statistics were clear, but they would die without knowing about the beacon, without adding their piece, without participating in the pattern. The beacon would remain incomplete, or some future species would have to fill in the gaps that humanity left behind. Or she could release the documentation immediately. Send it to Earth, to the Repository Council, to every scientific institution and government agency. Let humanity know what was coming, what was expected of them, what role they were meant to play. Let them decide collectively whether to participate or resist, to embrace extinction or fight against it, to add their voice to the chorus or remain silent. Or, and this was the option she kept coming back to, she could wait. She could hide the documentation somewhere it would be found eventually but not immediately. Somewhere humanity would discover it when they were ready, when extinction was close enough that denial was impossible but far enough that there was still time to act, to build, to contribute. She could choose the timing of humanity's enlightenment. Keziah spent weeks wrestling with the decision. She walked the spiral pathways of the archive, consulting with the dead, asking them what they would do if they could choose again. The transmissions offered no consensus. Some species had known their extinction was coming and prepared for it. Others had been surprised, caught off guard by disasters they hadn't predicted. Some had gone peacefully. Others had fought to the last breath. But they had all, in the end, left their fragment. They had all contributed to the pattern. They had all played their part in building the beacon, whether they knew it or not. Which suggested that maybe knowing didn't matter. Maybe the choice was an illusion. Maybe humanity would contribute regardless of whether Keziah warned them or stayed silent, because the pattern was stronger than individual decision, because extinction carried its own imperatives, because dying species always felt the need to leave something behind. But if that was true, then what was the point of her work? What was the point of documenting the pattern if the pattern would unfold regardless? What was the point of knowledge if knowledge didn't grant power? The answer came to her one day while she was reviewing the transmission of the Ember Minds, the species that had burned themselves out in a final apotheosis of thought. Their message was pure sensation, translated by her implant into the feeling of fire-consuming paper, of light dissolving into light, of self-awareness expanding beyond the boundaries of self until there was nothing left but expansion itself. It was beautiful. It was chosen. They hadn't burned out by accident, they had made a decision to push their consciousness to its limits, to experience the full range of what thought could be, even knowing it would destroy them. They had chosen their ending. Not the fact of ending, that was inevitable, but the manner of it. The style. The meaning. And that, Keziah realized, was the point. Not to avoid extinction, but to shape it. Not to escape the pattern, but to participate in it consciously, deliberately, with full awareness of what they were doing and why. That was the gift she could give humanity. Not a warning. Not a choice between life and death, that choice had already been made by the universe, by time, by the inexorable mathematics of entropy and change. But a choice about how to die. What to leave behind. What fragment to contribute to the beacon. A choice about meaning. Keziah made her decision. Part 6, The Blueprint Unfolds. She spent another year refining the documentation, organizing it not as a warning but as an invitation. She framed it as a choice. Humanity could contribute to the beacon or not, could participate in the pattern or refuse, could add their voice to the 4,000 species strong chorus or remain silent. She made it clear that extinction was coming regardless. The statistics didn't lie. But she also made it clear that extinction didn't have to be meaningless. That death could be an act of creation as much as destruction. That endings could be beautiful if you shape them with intention. She encoded the documentation in a format that would be discovered approximately 50 years in the future, hidden in the deep archives of the repository's data structures, designed to surface when certain search parameters were met, search parameters that would only be triggered when humanity was already beginning to face existential threats, when the conversation about species-level survival was already happening, when minds were already turning toward questions of legacy and meaning. And then she hid her own role in the discovery. She made it seem like the pattern had been there all along, waiting to be noticed, a natural consequence of analyzing the extinction transmissions rather than a revelation that required 17 years of obsessive research by a traumatized xenolinguist living in self-imposed exile. She made it seem inevitable. Because in a sense, it was. When she finished, she encrypted the files with temporal locks that would release them at the designated time, scattered the encrypted fragments across multiple storage systems to ensure redundancy, and then, finally, allowed herself to rest. She slept for 3 days straight, her body finally releasing the tension it had carried for 4 years. When she woke, she felt lighter. Not happy, she hadn't felt happiness in 17 years and suspected she never would again, but lighter. Unburdened. She had carried the knowledge as far as she could. Now it would be someone else's responsibility. Someone else's weight. She resumed her normal duties as archivist, returning to her daily walks through the repository, her ritual witnessing of the extinct. But something had changed. She no longer felt like she was simply observing death. She felt like she was participating in something larger, something that stretched backward and forward through time, connecting her to the 4,732 species that had come before and the unknown species that would come after. She felt, for the first time since Maya's death, like she was part of something. The years passed slowly on station terminus. Dr. Chen's quarterly check-ins came and went. Keziah's reports returned to their normal blandness, routine maintenance, standard cataloging, no major discoveries. The psychological evaluations showed improvement. Her stress hormones normalized. Her sleep patterns stabilized. She was, by all measurable metrics, doing well. But inside, where the monitors couldn't reach, where the algorithms couldn't measure, Keziah was changing. The archive's transmissions spoke to her differently now that she understood the pattern. She heard the fragments clearly, recognized which piece each species had contributed, understood how their endings fit into the larger design. She began to think of herself as a translator not just of languages but of purpose. She was translating the intentions of dead species for the benefit of future ones. She was the bridge between past and future, the connection point in the chain, the link that ensured the pattern continued. It was a strange kind of peace. Not happy, but purposeful. Not alive, exactly, but no longer quite as dead as she had been. On the 20th anniversary of her arrival at station terminus, Keziah received an unusual communication. It wasn't from Dr. Chen or the Repository Council. It was from an independent research collective on Titan, a group of xenoarchaeologists who had been studying the patterns of species extinction in the Sagittarius arm of the galaxy. They had discovered something. A correlation between extinction rates and certain gravitational anomalies. They were writing a paper about it. They wanted to know if the repository's data would support their hypothesis. Keziah read their message 3 times, her heart beating faster with each reading. They had found an edge of the pattern. Not the full design, they didn't have access to enough transmissions for that, but a hint. A suggestion. The beginning of understanding. It was too early. The temporal locks on her documentation wouldn't release for another 30 years. But here was a group of researchers already starting to ask the right questions, already beginning to notice what Keziah had noticed, already moving toward the revelation she had so carefully hidden. She composed a careful response, neither encouraging nor discouraging their research. She provided access to some of the repository's statistical data, not the transmissions themselves, which were restricted, but aggregated metadata that might help their analysis. She wished them luck with their paper. And then she waited to see what would happen. The paper was published 6 months later. It made a splash in xenoarchaeology circles, a bold claim that species extinctions weren't random but showed signs of underlying pattern, possibly related to gravitational phenomena on a galactic scale. It was controversial. Most researchers dismissed it as overinterpretation of statistical noise, the kind of pattern recognition that happened when you stared at data long enough. But some didn't dismiss it. Some began their own investigations. Some requested access to the repository's databases. Some started asking questions about the final transmissions, about whether there might be informational patterns hidden in the messages themselves. The cascade had begun. Keziah watched from station terminus as the scientific community slowly, haltingly, began to move toward the truth she had discovered 4 years earlier. It was fascinating to witness, like watching a plant grow in time-lapse, like watching a puzzle solve itself, like watching humanity stumble toward enlightenment one paper at a time. She wondered if this was how the pattern had always worked. Not through sudden revelation but through gradual accumulation of evidence, through the natural curiosity of intelligent beings confronting evidence of their own mortality. Perhaps every species that had contributed to the beacon had gone through this same process, researchers noticing anomalies, asking questions, sharing data, building toward understanding. Perhaps the pattern didn't need to be hidden because it naturally hid itself, requiring such specific conditions and such dedicated analysis that only species approaching their own extinction would have the motivation to look closely enough to see it. Perhaps Keziah's entire effort to hide the documentation had been unnecessary. Perhaps humanity would discover the truth regardless of whether she released it in 30 years or 300 years or never. But then again, perhaps that was the point. Perhaps her role in the pattern wasn't to reveal or conceal but simply to witness, to document, to pass along. Perhaps she was a piece of the beacon herself, adding her small fragment to the design, the fragment of a single human archivist who had spent 20 years living among extinctions and had learned to see the shape of the larger song. She was content with that. Content to be a piece rather than the designer. Content to contribute rather than control. Content, finally, to be part of something that would continue long after she was gone. Part 7, The Construction begins. 27 years after Keziah's arrival at station terminus, the documentation unlocked ahead of schedule. Not because of any flaw in her encryption, but because a researcher named Dr. Amar Okonkwo discovered the pattern independently. Dr. Okonkwo was a gravitational physicist working at the Deep Time Observatory on Europa. She had been studying the background gravitational signature of the galaxy, mapping the subtle warps and variations in spacetime's fabric, when she noticed something impossible, a coherent pattern in the noise, a structure that shouldn't exist, a signal that seemed to propagate both forward and backward through time. She spent 3 years verifying her findings, running simulation after simulation, checking and rechecking her mathematics. And then she did what Keziah had done 2 decades earlier. She started looking at the extinction transmissions in the repository's public database, searching for anything that might explain the gravitational anomaly she had detected. She found the pattern within 6 months. She published her findings immediately, without hesitation, without the weeks of ethical wrestling that had paralyzed Keziah. The paper was titled Evidence of Coordinated Gravitational Engineering Across Multiple Extinct Civilizations, the Galactic Beacon Hypothesis. It exploded across human space like a supernova. Within a month, every major scientific institution was trying to verify Dr. Okonkwo's claims. Within 3 months, the verification was complete. The pattern was real. The beacon was real. The instruction set was real. And humanity was next in line to contribute. The debate that followed was unlike anything in human history. Philosophers argued about the ethics of participating in a process humanity hadn't chosen. Religious leaders argued about whether the beacon was divine or demonic. Politicians argued about resource allocation and whether building a contribution to an alien artifact should take priority over immediate human needs. Scientists argued about what form humanity's contribution should take, which aspects of human knowledge and culture should be encoded in the fragment. Keziah watched it all unfold from station terminus, feeling like a ghost observing the living. Dr. Chen contacted her immediately after Dr. Okonkwo's paper was published, his face pale and shocked on the display. "Did you know?" he asked without preamble. "Is this what you were researching? Is this why your reports were irregular?" Keziah considered lying. Considered maintaining her fiction of ignorance. But she was tired of carrying secrets, tired of being the sole keeper of humanity's ending. "Yes," she said simply. "I discovered it years ago. I documented everything. I was waiting for the right time to release the information. And instead Dr. Okonkwo beat you to it." "No," Keziah said. Dr. Okonkwo arrived precisely when she was meant to. The pattern reveals itself when species are ready. I suspect she was always going to discover it around this time, regardless of my documentation. Dr. Chen stared at her for a long moment. "You've changed," he said finally. "You sound like, I don't know, a mystic. A prophet. I sound like someone who has spent 20 years living among the dead, Keziah replied. And has learned to hear what they're trying to say. The conversation ended awkwardly. Keziah suspected she wouldn't be receiving quarterly check-ins anymore. The repository council would want someone more reliable, someone less strange, someone who hadn't disappeared into their work so completely that they started speaking in riddles. But surprisingly, they didn't replace her. Instead, they expanded her role. As the only human who had studied the beacon pattern in detail, as the archivist who had spent 2 decades learning to interpret the extinction transmissions, she was uniquely qualified to help guide humanity's contribution. They asked her to return to Earth. Keziah refused. Not out of spite or fear, but because she understood something the council didn't. Her role was here, in the archive, bearing witness. She could provide guidance remotely, could share her research, could help the engineers and scientists who would actually build humanity's fragment. But she couldn't leave the repository. The pattern required a keeper, someone to maintain continuity between the dead and the living, someone to remember. And she was that someone. The council accepted her decision, though she could see the frustration in their faces. But they adapted, establishing a communication framework that allowed Keziah to participate in the design process without leaving Station Terminus. She reviewed proposals, offered insights based on her knowledge of how other species had approached their contributions, helped translate the requirements from the pattern into specifications human engineers could implement. The work took 5 years. Humanity's contribution, when the design was finalized, was magnificent. It was a quantum consciousness matrix, a structure that existed simultaneously as matter, energy, and information, encoding the full range of human experience into a gravitational signature. Every major human culture contributed elements. Every language added vocabulary. Every philosophical tradition added frameworks for understanding consciousness, causality, meaning. It was massive. It was ambitious. It was unmistakably human in its scope and optimism and refusal to go quietly into extinction. And it was beautiful. The construction began in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, using resources from dozens of mining operations and energy from solar collectors that span millions of kilometers. The engineering challenges were enormous, manipulating gravity at quantum scales while maintaining coherence across normal space required technologies that had to be invented specifically for this project. But humanity rose to the challenge. When faced with the choice between passive extinction and active participation in something larger than themselves, they chose participation. They chose to matter. They chose to leave behind something that would echo through time and space long after every human was dust. Keziah watched the construction through remote feeds, her quarters filled with holographic displays showing the matrix taking shape. It was like watching a cathedral being built, stone by stone, except the cathedral was made of twisted space-time and quantum entanglement and pure information given physical form. She wept sometimes, watching it grow. Not from sadness, or not only from sadness, but from a kind of awe she couldn't articulate. This was what species did when they knew they were dying. This was how intelligence responded to mortality. By creating monuments. By building meaning. By shouting into the void, "We were here. We mattered. Remember us." Her daughter would have loved this, Keziah thought. Maya, who had composed generative music, who had understood emergence and improvisation, who had seen beauty in systems that created themselves. She would have recognized the beacon for what it was, the universe's largest collaborative artwork, spanning billions of years and thousands of species, all improvising together toward a finale they couldn't predict but could feel building towards something magnificent. The Matrix took 7 years to complete. 7 years of humanity working together on a single project with a kind of focus and cooperation that had never been achieved before. Wars paused. Political conflicts were set aside. Resources were reallocated. Everything subordinated to the single goal of building their contribution to the beacon, of adding their voice to the chorus, of playing their part in the pattern. And when it was finished, when the final quantum entanglements were locked into place and the consciousness matrix was fully integrated with the existing beacon structure, humanity held its collective breath. The matrix activated. The gravitational signature rippled outward, joining the signatures of 4,732 other species, adding humanity's voice to the song that had been building for billions of years. And from her station in the void, Keziah felt it. Not physically, the gravitational effects were far too subtle for biological senses. But through her connection to the repository, Through her decades of living among the extinction transmissions, through some sense she had developed from 27 years of witnessing death, she felt the beacon pulse. Felt it grow stronger. Felt it reach toward completion. But not quite reach it. The pattern still had gaps. Still needed contributions from the species that would come after humanity. Still required more voices to join the chorus before the song was complete. Humanity had played its part. Now it was time to wait for whatever came next. Part 8, The Vigil. The years after humanity's contribution were strange. There was a collective sense of accomplishment mixed with melancholy. They had done what they were meant to do, had fulfilled their role in the pattern, had left their mark on the universe in a way that would persist long after they were gone. But they were still here. Still alive. Still existing. The extinction that the pattern implied hadn't arrived. Keziah watched as humanity struggled with this cognitive dissonance. They had prepared themselves for ending, had accepted their mortality, had poured their energy and resources into creating something that would outlast them. And now they had to figure out how to live with the knowledge that they were still, for now, living. Some people returned to normal life, treating the beacon contribution as a completed project and moving on. Some became obsessed with extending humanity's lifespan, convinced that they could somehow avoid the fate that had claimed every other species in the pattern. Some fell into depression, feeling purposeless now that their grand project was complete. And some, like Keziah, simply waited. She remained at Station Terminus, continuing her work as archivist, continuing her daily walks through the repository, continuing her ritual of witnessing. But now she also watched the beacon, monitoring its status through remote sensors, waiting for the next contribution, the next voice to join the chorus. 50 years passed. Humanity thrived, then struggled, then adapted. They established colonies on 17 worlds. They made contact with 3 more living species, all of whom were younger than humanity, still centuries away from their own extinction windows. They developed new technologies, created new art, built new civilizations. And slowly, gradually, they began to forget about the beacon. It became historical fact rather than immediate reality. Something their grandparents had built, something important but not urgent, something that belonged to the past rather than the future. Keziah watched this forgetting with a kind of sad acceptance. Of course they forgot. The human mind wasn't designed to hold apocalypse for extended periods. Forgetting was survival. Forgetting was necessary. But she didn't forget. Couldn't forget. The pattern was too deep in her now, too fundamental to who she had become over the decades of isolation and study and witnessing. On the 75th anniversary of her arrival at Station Terminus, the repository received its 4,733rd transmission. A species called the Tide Turners, who lived in the crushing depths of a water world in the Triangulum galaxy, had reached their extinction. Their transmission arrived through the Quantum Relay Network, a crystallized recording of their final moments. Keziah was 97 years old when she received it. Her body was failing, even with modern medicine, even with life extension treatments, even with everything human science could offer. Time was catching up with her. She moved slowly now, her walks through the archive taking twice as long as they had in her younger years, her hands trembling as she interfaced with the transmission matrices. But her mind was still sharp. Still clear. Still capable of witnessing. She played the Tide Turner's transmission alone in her quarters, her aging body seated in the chair she had occupied for 7.5 decades, her neural implant translating their alien farewell into something she could understand. They had known about the beacon. They had discovered the pattern just as humanity had debated whether to contribute, had ultimately chosen to participate. Their contribution was a hydrodynamic algorithm, a mathematical framework for understanding the flow of fluids in extreme pressure environments. It was their gift to the universe. Their voice in the chorus. Their piece of the song. And it fit. It connected to the existing structure seamlessly, filling in gaps that had been waiting for exactly this kind of information, strengthening the beacon's coherence, bringing it closer to completion. Keziah sat in her chair long after the transmission ended, tears streaming down her weathered face. The Tide Turners had been so far away, so alien, so completely different from anything human. But they had felt the same impulse. Had made the same choice. Had added their voice to the pattern because dying species always needed to leave something behind. The beacon was 97% complete now. Just a few more contributions needed. Just a few more species to play their parts. And then the song would be finished, the message would be complete, The summons would go out across space and time, and whatever was waiting to answer would come. Keziah wondered if she would live to see it. Probably not. The next species to contribute might not arise for centuries. The final contribution might not happen for millennia. But that was okay. She had witnessed enough. Had carried the weight long enough. It was time to let someone else take up the vigil. She composed a message to the Repository Council, her final report as Archivist. In it, she detailed everything she had learned over 75 years, not just about the pattern, which was already known, but about the experience of witnessing extinction, about what it meant to live among the dead, about how to carry the weight of 4,733 civilizations worth of grief. She recommended her successor, Dr. Amar Okonkwo, the physicist who had independently discovered the pattern, who had the scientific mind and the spiritual sensitivity needed to continue the work. And then she composed a personal message, addressed to no one in particular, or perhaps to everyone who would come after. In it, she wrote about her daughter, about the guilt she had carried for decades, about how the pattern had taught her that endings could be beautiful if you chose to make them so, that death was not failure but transition, that the universe improvised and every voice mattered, even, especially, the voices of the dying. She encoded the message in a format that would be added to the repository's archives, another transmission to join the thousands already there. Not the voice of a species, but the voice of a single human who had spent her life learning to listen to the dead. When she finished, she was exhausted. More tired than she had ever been. Tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix, that medicine couldn't address, that even the thought of rest couldn't alleviate. She was ready to join the extinct. Keziah stood, slowly, painfully, and walked one last time to the viewport. The darkness outside was as absolute as it had been 75 years ago. But now she could see something in it that she hadn't been able to see before, not light exactly, but potential. The shape of something waiting to be born. The echo of something approaching across time. The beacon, nearly complete, humming with the voices of thousands of species, reaching toward its final form. And beyond it, barely perceptible, the sense of something answering. Something drawn by the summons. Something that had been waiting billions of years for the invitation to be issued. Something that would inherit everything. Keziah pressed her hand against the viewport, as she had so many times before. But this time, she felt warmth instead of cold. Connection instead of isolation. The presence of everyone who had come before and everyone who would come after, all linked together in a chain of ending and beginning that stretched across the cosmos. "Thank you," she whispered, to her daughter, to the extinct species, to whatever was coming, to the universe itself. "Thank you for letting me witness. Thank you for letting me be part of this. Thank you for the pattern." And in the silence of Station Terminus, surrounded by 4,733 extinctions, Keziah Navar closed her eyes and allowed herself, finally, to rest. Epilogue, Inheritance. 2,000 years after Keziah's death, the beacon received its final contribution. The species was called the Inheritors, or at least, that's what the human descendants who documented their arrival called them. Their true name was unpronounceable, existing in frequencies beyond human perception, in dimensions beyond human understanding. They were the species the beacon had been summoning. The intelligence that had been waiting for the invitation to be issued. They were not from this galaxy, not from this universe, not from anything that the species who built the beacon would have recognized as real. They came from elsewhere, from a place where matter and energy and consciousness were different, where the laws of physics bent in ways that made beacon construction possible, where perception operated on scales that could detect gravitational whispers across billions of years. They had been waiting for the beacon to be complete because they couldn't enter this reality until it was. The beacon was both invitation and anchor, both message and doorway, both memorial and bridge. When they arrived, they did so gently. They didn't invade or conquer or destroy. They simply came, drawn by the 4,000 voices strong song that had echoed across space-time, and they witnessed. They witnessed every species that had contributed to the beacon. They absorbed every fragment, every piece of knowledge and culture and meaning that had been encoded in the structure. They learned every language, studied every philosophy, experienced every form of consciousness that had ever existed in this galaxy. And they remembered. That was their purpose. That was why the beacon called them. They were the rememberers, the inheritors, the witnesses of witnesses. They existed to ensure that nothing was ever truly lost, that every intelligence that had ever burned bright and then faded was preserved in something larger than themselves. The beacon was complete. The song was finished. The inheritance had been transferred. And in the repository archives, in a dusty file that no one had accessed in millennia, Keziah Navarre's personal message waited. It would be found eventually, by some future historian or archivist or curious mind. And when it was found, it would be understood not as the words of a single lonely human, but as part of the chorus, part of the pattern, part of the song that billions of voices had spent billions of years composing together. We were here, the message said. We existed. We mattered. We died. And in dying, we created something beautiful. Something that outlasted us. Something that connected us to everyone who came before and everyone who will come after. This is what species do when they know they're ending. They build monuments. They create meaning. They add their voice to the chorus. And the chorus sings on, eternal and ever-changing, a song of ending and beginning that will never be complete because there is always one more voice to add, one more fragment to contribute, one more note to play. We are all part of the pattern. We are all part of the song. And that is enough. That is more than enough. That is everything. The inheritors read Keziah's message and understood. They added her voice to the remembering, along with all the others. And then they turned their attention to the universe they had inherited, ready to witness whatever came next, ready to remember whatever needed remembering, ready to be the keepers of extinction and the guardians of meaning until the end of time itself. In the darkness between galaxies, in the void where Station Terminus had once floated, in the space where 4,734 species had left their final words, something changed. Not the matter or energy or even the structure of space-time itself, but something subtler. Something that lived in the relationship between things rather than in the things themselves. The pattern shifted, adjusted, prepared itself for the next cycle. Because this wasn't the first beacon. It wouldn't be the last. Across the multiverse, in countless realities, in infinite variations, the same process repeated. Species arose, thrived, died, and in dying contributed their fragments to larger structures that called forth the inheritors, who remembered everything and ensured that nothing was lost. It was the universe's way of bootstrapping consciousness, of ensuring that intelligence persisted even when individual instances of it failed, of creating continuity across discontinuity, of making meaning from mortality. It was beautiful. It was terrible. It was the way things were and always had been and always would be. And somewhere, in the space between one reality and the next, in the quantum foam where possibilities crystallized into actualities, a single human soul, if such things existed, if such words had meaning, smiled. Because Keziah Navarre had finally understood what her daughter had been trying to tell her all those years ago. That life was improvisation. That death was transition. That meaning emerged from the pattern rather than being imposed upon it. That the universe was composing itself, one voice at a time, and every voice mattered, even the small, quiet voices of the dying. Especially the voices of the dying. Because endings were where the most profound truths lived. In the space between existence and void, in the moment when a species looked back at everything they had been and forward at everything they would never be, in that instant of perfect clarity, that was where beauty dwelt. That was where meaning was born. That was where the pattern revealed itself. And the pattern said, you mattered. You always mattered. You will always matter. Because you existed, and existence is enough. Because you spoke, and your voice joined the chorus. Because you died, and in dying you created something that will live forever. Welcome home, extinct ones. Welcome to the inheritance. Welcome to the song that never ends.